Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us. We all fly, but most people don't realize what's happening behind the scenes to keep airports secure, connected, and running smoothly. What feels like a seamless experience actually powered by incredibly complex systems, where security, infrastructure, and operations all have to work together in real time. As technology continues to evolve, that challenge is only getting more complex. To help us unpack this, I'm joined by two subject matter experts who are working at the forefront of these challenges every single day. First, we have Serena Sacks-Mandel, Field Chief Technology Officer at MGT. Serena is an international award-winning technology leader who advises global enterprises and government organizations on strategy, transformation, and innovation at scale. And joining her is Chris Lariscy, Principal Solutions Architect at MGT. Chris brings over 16 years of experience in cybersecurity across multiple industries and is a recognized leader in security and governance, holding certifications including CISSP and GIAC Certified Incident Handler. Serena and Chris, thank you so much for being here. I'd like to kick us off on a question. What are you both seeing change the fastest in airport technology right now, and why is that creating new challenges?
Kennedy, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm not only a frequent traveler, frequent flyer, diamond on Delta, which I'm very proud of, but I also support many airports across the country with their cybersecurity operations and other opportunities to innovate and modernize. So what I'm seeing consistently is that the top airports across the country are modernizing their facilities, putting in beautiful ceilings and areas for travelers to eat, to shop, to just relax and explore in between flights. However, some of the conveniences like Wi-Fi and electricity as ports to charge and even their cybersecurity behind the scenes is not necessarily keeping up. So we're seeing a lot of investment in the front end of the customer experience, but not necessarily the modernization of the technology behind the scenes. Chris, what are you seeing?
For sure, and thank you for having me today. Pleasure to be here as well. So yeah, what's really seems to be changing the fastest is really just like Serena said, is the sheer volume of connected systems airports are being asked to support. The speed that they're being deployed is also rapidly increasing. We're seeing biometric screening, AI-powered threat detection, real-time passenger flow analytics. All of this is landing on top of network infrastructure that in a lot of cases was designed 10, 15 years ago and was really designed to run on a fraction of the throughput that's required for these new tools. The challenge doesn't seem to be technology itself. It's kind of more in how the technology works. The challenge is airports are highly regulated, multi-stakeholder environments. You've got TSA, Homeland Security, airlines, concessionaires, ground handlers. They all have different requirements, different risk tolerances, and different timelines. And we're seeing struggles with the organizations and how the infrastructure is trying to serve all of them simultaneously. What it really means, like Serena explained, is when you push high definition biometric streams across switching fabric that was spec'd out for badge readers and flight displays on TVs, you get a lot of bottlenecks at the checkpoint. Slowdowns in the biometric verifications, passenger throughput drops. It's really hard to pass people through security checkpoints if the tools don't work. And now you spend, millions, hundreds of millions, tens of millions of dollars on technology that's actually making the experience worse because we're seeing slowdowns. It just can't keep up with the demands that are being made on it. Airports getting this right are the ones treating infrastructure modernization as a prerequisite for adopting this technology and focusing on the passenger experience, not just the new tools.
Kind of transitioning more into people and culture, with the technology challenges, having these culture of heroes, what does that mean?
Sure. So this really speaks to the organizational side of airport information technology. It seems to be a pretty big symptom. It's what I call a culture of heroes. You have not enough people constantly putting out fires and not being able to do the foundational and the long-term work to keep systems safe, secure, and available. So the problem with the culture of heroes is that it is a recipe for burnout, and you're not necessarily doing the best job. You're just stopping problems as they pop up. So it's interrupt driven. And part of that problem comes from this tribal knowledge risks. People know what they've done for years and years, but as they either retire out or transition to other roles, the people moving in don't necessarily know how to do things. So this defined repeatable processes is the antidote for culture of heroes. If everybody knows what their role, their responsibility, and the process is to get their work done, it's calmer. You can do things more thoughtfully, more effectively, and you don't have the fires. The other problem with fires is that when there is no fire, people sometimes create them because they don't want to be obsolete. They see their job as, look at me, I'm a hero, I'm putting out a fire. And if there is no fire, what do I do? So we need to change hearts and minds and skill sets to execute repeatable processes and use ticketing systems and configuration change management, things to keep the system stable. And that is necessary for scalable processes. So the things that Chris are talking about in terms of making the infrastructure more robust, that requires a scaled out infrastructure. Now, on top of that, we're seeing consistent budget constraints. How do we get all of these things done on the same or fewer dollars? And once again, it's about implementing the right roles, responsibilities, and expectations for each person and implementing repeatable processes and using the right tools, the right technologies to get the job done more efficiently and more effectively within the budget. Also, what we're seeing consistently is providers, management service providers for their security operations. So the job within the organization is more to manage the managed service provider, the MSP, versus doing all the work. Instead of running around putting out fires, they're managing the MSP to provide top quality service. And the benefit of that is that they work 24/7, not just during business hours. And of course, airports operate 24/7.
So absolutely. They know every switch config, every cable run, and every workaround they've done for the last decades. And in some instances, they kind of hoard that knowledge. What we strive to push forward is developing not just the people, which is the culture of heroes Serena's discussed, it's the policies and processes that go along with those so that we can create repeatable and consistent outcomes. It kind of retires the hero culture to just where it's needed in the event of an outage or a disruption, instead of making it the status quo for an organization. Business risk is significant when we keep all of that institutional knowledge inside of people's heads and inside of the tribal knowledge realm. Instead of documented playbooks or run books, you wind up with corners of the infrastructure that have been unpatched, that have been left to rot, that are no longer needed or used by the organization. In some instances, providing direct reduction in security and increase in available attack surface because of that. Your mean time to recovery goes down. Downtime in an airport isn't just lost productivity, it's security gaps, it's flight delays, it's passenger backups, it's missed connections, and ultimately it can even result in regulatory scrutiny from the Department of Homeland Security or the TSA. So it's not about replacing the culture of heroes, actual heroes, it's about replacing the culture itself and determining what actually makes a hero inside of the culture are the people who drive maturity, drive standardization, drive consistency, and build repeatable, consistent processes to drive workflow and outcomes in the business and the technical side of the organization.
Very well said.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned infrastructure, Chris, just previously, and how should airport leaders actually prepare for all of this new technology when their infrastructure is just not ready for it?
Yeah, so the first place to truly start is an honest assessment of where you are. You've got to know where you are today in a point in time and identify where the gaps exist for where you want to be. And that's not just based on the last time you built your capital expense plan or your investment plan. It's where you actually are. What's the age of your switching and routing infrastructure? What are the age of your firewalls and your security tooling? What's your current throughput capacity versus what will all of the new and improved systems that you're planning to bring online require? Where are the single points of failure? If you're running everything through a single firewall and that firewall goes down, or you have a single internet provider, if that piece of technology disappears from your infrastructure, you have a significant lapse in security, you have a significant lapse in availability. A lot of airports I've worked with have very modern pockets of infrastructure, but they are also interspersed and surrounded by this 10, 15-year-old infrastructure. They built in some new switching fabric that's high speed to run the AI-powered, weapons detection and security checkpoints, but that connects to a 100 meg or 1 gig backbone, even though it really should be a 10 gigabit connection back to the core. Just creating artificial performance bottlenecks that don't need to exist because we're not making the investment outside of that bubble of new technology adoption. I like to call that kind of the island mode, these little islands of modernization inside of a legacy infrastructure.
Yeah, so I'll just start with the island mode. By modernizing pieces of the infrastructure, some organizations are kind of become complacent, like, oh, well, we have modernized. But often there are, as Chris said, these very difficult areas where a device may not only be out of warranty, but out of service. So it's not being supported, it's not being upgraded. And that is, as Chris said, an increased attack surface. So it isn't enough to just look at sort of the bright and shiny parts that have been modernized, but really to do this deep assessment of the technology and the people, the structure, the roles, responsibilities. I go back to that because they work together. Technology is only as good as the people managing it and overseeing it, patching it, keeping it up to date. So I think both the people and the technology are incredibly important to assess in an unbiased way. And that's why we recommend, and even when I was a CIO, I would bring in an external consultant to do assessments because we don't want our internal people coloring those assessments either intentionally or unintentionally.
Absolutely. We usually really do push the identifying the hidden infrastructure costs or gaps. Things like if we don't build fail-safe architectures, are we going to have to fall back to manual security checks, manual passenger processing, printing out boarding passes? Can we even print out boarding passes anymore? We really focus on building that holistic plan first, and that starts with what's coming and those gaps, like Serena mentioned. Third-party independent assessment is the gold standard for that because that is a truly unbiased outside look in. Just like if we're writing a paper or something back in our college days, you've stared at it for so long, you start to see what you expect it to see, not what's actually there. It always helps to have a fresh set of eyes. The airports that really focus in on this and the organizations as a whole that really focus in on this avoid a lot of big $1 million last of the minute budget overrun surprises when they try and roll out these new biometric systems, these new AI powered systems, because the network itself really can't handle it because they've already identified that gap and built it into the investment plan.
Yeah, and Chris, I want to point out what you're saying is so accurate that organizations that feel like, oh, we don't have the budget, but yet when there is a breach, that can cost millions, and then they have to come up with the money to do that. So isn't it less expensive to have the assessment, remediate the issues, rather than try to fund a huge breach? What, in your experience, how much does a breach cost?
For sure. So, breaches typically cost, it really depends on the organization, but especially when we get into credit monitoring, reputational damage, which exceeds beyond the actual breach itself, we're talking anywhere from tens to hundreds of millions of dollars for modern organizations, especially on the airport side. That can grow exponentially when you start talking about fines from regulatory bodies like the TSA, DHS. If you do any payment processing for PCI, DSS, those types of things can quickly run the costs up with fines as well. And typically it is more cost effective to plan appropriately ahead of time, conduct the assessment, get a real understanding of where your organization is, so you can build in that modernization plan not only as a large scale project, but you can start putting that where it belongs in your other projects. If you're modernizing the HVAC system, the cabling, the POS systems in one of your areas, maybe it's time to look at also upgrading the switching infrastructure around that and being able to break that up into more manageable projects. If you're building in new AI-enabled checkpoints or physical security cameras, then maybe it's also time to take a look at what your internet service provider is for your throughput to backhaul any of that video, any of those AI LLM requests, those types of things back. We would want to really take a holistic view of what surrounds the initiative you're driving forward.
And aren't we seeing, simply because attackers know that the investments haven't necessarily been made in security for the back end of airports, aren't we seeing an increase in attacks on airports because they're high value targets and they're often not as protected as they should be?
For sure. We're seeing 600%, I believe, one of the last figures I saw, year-over-year increases in cyber attacks targeting the aviation industry in general. Ransomware is one of the largest attacks being launched in general. We're seeing 71% of those involving credential theft. We have examples from all over the world. Paris Air Show, Thales CTI, all of these breaches have been typically characterized by ransomware and credential theft. These target airports systemically, specifically because of their lack of investment or capability to invest in the infrastructure, because of the initiatives they have for the modernization of their checkpoint processing, the AI initiatives that are being put in for facial recognition. They don't always have the budget left over or allocated properly to backfill the actual infrastructure requirements to support those tools.
Speaking of cyber attacks, when something goes wrong, who actually owns it? And what I mean by that is, where do things typically fall, on your vendors, and are things slipping through the cracks?
So, not to be a salesperson at all, but if you have a partner helping you with your security, then obviously, we would be helping you resolve those issues immediately. We have teams set up for those emergencies, and we would help you stop it and recover quickly whatever issues have already occurred. So, Chris, I think you could probably elaborate on that.
Yeah, so really talking about what it looks like for threats facing the airport industry in general kind of gets into what that attack surface is. We've already discussed a little bit about that with the year-over-year increase in attacks. We're seeing those attacks. There's pro-Russia hacktivists that actively have been exploiting OT environments. We are seeing a lot of DDoS attacks also being launched against various aviation and airports. That is only being ramped up and escalated with the current state of the geopolitical climate. We are going to continue to see that. Airports are a great place to disrupt the populace. Airports are a great place to attempt to reduce the physical security of those passing through it by launching technology-based attacks. When we get into incident response, especially when we're talking any sort of government-adjacent agency like airports typically are, in any organization, government adjacent or not, typically the response falls predominantly on the IT organization and the IT teams. If they happen to have a dedicated cybersecurity team, that is where a lot of it lands. Typically, they leverage their connection to a managed services provider, an incident response, or cyber insurance provider to get assistance in those breaches. The problem that we see very often, though, is none of the other business units have been consulted on the incident response plan or how to recover or deal with a breach. So we're left making a lot of decisions on the fly, and consulting with various airports has shown us over time that the correct approach to addressing that from a proactive standpoint is through situational awareness. We drive that through tabletop exercises, as well as the gap assessments, penetration tests, and maturity assessments that we've discussed previously. The goal there is figure out what you have, figure out how to take and understand what you have, and apply that to a disruption event like an incident or a breach or an intrusion. And we do that correctly, we're able to not only figure out the technical response, but also how that affects the business itself and tied directly to business outcomes, business disruption events like extended delays at the security checkpoints, inability to check bags. Airports can't dispatch flights. Air traffic control can't do the tasks that are required for them to keep everyone safe in the air and on the ground. We can tie those business outcomes directly to technical initiatives to drive investment in the security program and to get buy-in both from an executive level and across departmental level on supporting our security initiatives moving forward. And that turns incident response from a purely cybersecurity or information technology problem into what it really is in today's world, which is an organizational and a business problem for airports, for the latest commercial Fortune 100, Fortune 500, or the mom and pop shop. It is never just a technology problem. It's a problem that affects the organization as a whole.
So if I could add on to that, it's critically important to have an incident response plan so that everybody knows what the plan is, who has to be contacted, who's included before something happens. And then something that Chris does that I think is so helpful for organizations is called a tabletop exercise. And they actually use that IRP in a simulated attack and help everybody get comfortable with, okay, if this was a real attack, this is what I would do, this is how it would operate. And you're testing out that plan ahead of time to make sure that if and when something happens, everybody knows what they have to do. They've been through it before. It's a practice drill. And the tabletop exercise also yields suggestions for improvement and information, because constructive advice.
Like I mentioned, accelerating the attacks against aerospace and aviation in general, as we've seen in Collins Aerospace, as we've seen in several other attacks, a lot of these are ransomware groups. A lot of these are either nation state empowered or they are affiliate driven ransomware as a service, which is more financially motivated than socio-political. But what we're seeing in all of these attacks across the board, whether it be ransomware or the latest person who installed Kali Linux and tried to figure out what they can do, is a lot of this is being driven by AI. AI is allowing people with a lot less technical capability to launch sophisticated spear phishing attacks. Use open source intelligence to profile and build attacks targeted specifically to spear phish vulnerable or high value targets inside of aviation organizations. It's now taking so much less time to launch and craft these attacks. We're seeing almost a 200% faster turnaround on these attacks, where it used to take 16 hours to stand up the infrastructure and launch an attack. People can do it in 5 minutes with something like ChatGPT or Copilot or Claude, spinning up and building all of the infrastructure and launching an attack. The other thing it's allowing people to do is basically monitor what's happening and respond to it real time. If they start getting responses back to their attacks, they can use an AI workflow to immediately go try and exploit that and create persistence. We weren't seeing that in the past because it all needed to be driven manually. Someone would log in, collect the results, and move forward the process. We're not seeing as much manual attacks anymore. We're seeing a much larger amount of widespread distributed attacks that are hitting a larger surface and being able to pivot and respond more rapidly to successes. In relation to next-gen networks, what we're seeing is specifically related to the underpowered networks. That's still a problem. Those statistics, while they seem crazy, are actually real. 400 to 700 megabits per second for a single checkpoint is pretty realistic with the number of cameras, the CT machines that are running, the signage, all of that. A lot of cases we're seeing, especially in the smaller regional airports, this is still running on a 10, 100 meg infrastructure. Maybe they've gone up to 1 gig. The problem with that is even if you've gone up to 1 gig, if you have more than 4 checkpoints, you're going to quickly overrun the throughput you have available for your backbone. We are seeing now a trend where 67% of airports are prioritizing upgrades. The issue, though, is about 86% of the upgrades they're prioritizing, even related to the IT infrastructure, center around building efficiency, energy management systems, emission reduction, not directly related to the backbone infrastructure itself. The other areas that we're seeing high investment, again, as we discussed a bit previously, is in the investment in new biometrics, new AI tooling, new data-driven systems to enhance passenger flow, security, and marketing. Not so much on do we have appropriate switching infrastructure, appropriate routing configurations and designs to support the current needs of the environment. As Serena kind of mentioned, OT is a very difficult challenge for a lot of organizations that have traditionally not participated in OT, or OT was a smaller piece of their overall pie before. OT has continuously increased over the last few years, driven a lot by automation through things like AI, through new machines, new robotic enhancements, anything that's assisting with the speed and efficiency of the work is a lot of times rolling under OT now. The problem with that is the infrastructure hasn't built itself around supporting security or separation between the traditional IT and OT environments. A lot of attacks both into the IT network or the OT network pivot from one or the other. In a lot of scenarios, those HVAC systems, those sensors, badge machines aren't updated as frequently and aren't running as hardened of security systems as some other tooling. You can't run EDR on a HVAC thermostat. We've seen instances across various casinos and other organizations where OT or Internet of Things has been a path in for a larger breach. We have also seen the opposite, where someone has been phished and had their machine compromised, and that's transitioned into the OT network, causing severe delays or disruption in tools, the processes that are required to do things like handle baggage, load bags on planes, get bags to the correct plane. Traditional tools, like I said, SIM, EDR, they don't have visibility into things like Modbus, DNP3, BACnet that are required to run those OT devices and networks. So again, pivoting back to where we started, understanding what you have from an OT environment, understanding what you have from an IT environment, and where those two paths cross is critical to any organization, so we can design the appropriate technical and governance controls around how to secure those environments.
So just we'll give an example to simplify OT versus IT. Most people that live in an older home have an old thermostat that you manually adjust, and it may be taking the temperature. Thermostat is a very kind of mechanical device that's just taking the temperature, whereas a lot of newer homes have a Nest or an automated scheduling device that is speaking to your phone. You have an app on your phone to control it, and that's the more modern OT. But is it vulnerable because it is attached to your phone? So that's IT versus OT.
Absolutely. That's the typical pattern, Serena. IT owns the network, individual owns the device. But the problem is there's an air gap between the two that no one owns. A camera system can get deployed with default credentials because the vendor said they'd handle it, but they didn't, right? An MSSP monitoring the network traffic, but they don't have any visibility into the OT protocols, means that missed firmware update on OT side could cause leak over into the IT side, or could allow those OT platforms to become vulnerable to a contained breach inside of the IT network. It really shows that the business consequence is real because lateral movement exploits these gaps. You can get through a device that nobody's monitoring. You can move laterally across the flat network if there's no segmentation in place. And by the time you've already detected it, they've already dwelled, created persistence, and gotten deep into the environment.
Great point. Chris, and our assessments would look at the OT environment as well, correct?
Yes, we would typically encourage you to include the OT environment in what we're looking at. Obviously, there are some issues with that depending on where that OT infrastructure lives, but we try and, at a minimum, if you have a contractor or a vendor, we want to also risk profile those vendors if we can, and make sure we understand what they're doing to mitigate the risk of their tools. We would also check for, through a vulnerability management engagement or a penetration test, for any default credentials or paths for exploitation. Because really what we found is the path for this is, stealing on a buzzword I've used several times here, it's holistic. It's holistic oversight. Whether that's internal, whether it's a managed services partner, somebody needs to own the full picture across network, security, IT, OT. And you have to have that unified visibility because that's the only way to catch lateral movement earlier. That's the only way to figure out if OT traffic is anomalous before it turns into a breach. And it's the only way you can keep the systems running that passengers and airlines need. The airports that unify this ownership are the ones that really have the shorter runway to response times, and they have less disruption and fewer unplanned outages.
Chris, if you could give airport leaders action to take today, what would it be?
So the way I typically try and express this with the clients I consult with are, you really need to pick your tier. So where are you currently and what problem are you trying to solve? What we see from an output standpoint or a result standpoint is, for what we've listed here for tier 1, we see about 88% of tabletop exercises reveal some form of degraded OT detection or some hidden gap. So when we're talking about tier 1, we're trying to assess where you really are. That's that beginning foundational step. This is what we would consider a low effort from a management burden standpoint, because it's kind of all on the consultant to assist you in figuring out where you are, whether that is from a maturity level of where you fall in accordance or alignment to a framework from a governance and technical control standpoint, where you stand on a technical gap analysis, or where you've prioritized your investment or roadmap for the future of your cybersecurity, network infrastructure, data center, cloud journey. It also focuses on tabletop exercises, which are those scenario-based incident response testing. That's where we actually determine how are our people, processes, and technology actually functioning in our environment, and how have we trained, planned, and created decision and escalation trees that will help us deal with disruption and breaches. It gets a real baseline of your maturity, your security posture, and your operational dependencies, because it's hard to build that roadmap and determine where you're going to spend your dollars on technology without understanding your infrastructure foundation. Otherwise, you're kind of gambling on whether you're going to deliver the passenger experience and security outcomes that you're expecting. If you've already done a gap assessment, or you already have an idea of where you are and you're already doing tabletop exercises, what we also need to move into then would be something that is helping you to respond, collect, and correlate the data that you're receiving, and also respond to it in a continuous and 24/7, 365 way. So what we're trying to do here is align our infrastructure investment with the technology demands. You're deploying AI, biometrics, you're deploying all of these new technologies. They all have servers, they all have some component that are driving them, workstations. You want to make sure that we're monitoring and managing that. You want to make sure that you have a single pane of glass or a unified monitoring that's seeing your IT and your OT environment, that's seeing where data is traversing your network and going between those two environments. One of the strongest ways to begin that is collecting all of the logs and using an MSP or your own NOC or SOC to have someone watching the monitor every day and making sure that as alerts are coming in, they're being properly escalated, triaged, and handled. The larger component to that is when we're crossing the office side of the house, the OT side of the house, and the server infrastructure side of the house, we need a consistent security posture. Doing that through managed detection and response or extended detection and response is the path we see a lot of clients taking, and that's the recommended path. What that allows you to do is control both the telemetry coming from the endpoints, the network devices, your cloud solutions, your email gateways, all into a single location that's building upon the old SIM and SOAR capabilities to provide a more extended and managed, typically by a third party like a MSSP, that's providing that 24/7 response. In that scenario, you're getting all of your data in one place, you're getting all of your logs in one place, and you have both AI tooling, programmatic automation, and human oversight all assisting in your triage and providing you appropriate recommendations. And in some cases, especially as we get into tier 3, fully managed element management services to help remediate on the fly. What we see is when we have customers that are embracing fully the 24/7, 365 knock and SOC, especially combined with MDR and XDR, we're seeing dwell times dwindle down to 5 days, where in a lot of scenarios they would have been 42 or higher days in the past. We're seeing significantly faster detections and response, and we're striving every day to get that even lower. If you already have those tier 1, tier 2 things in place, it never hurts to evaluate them and make sure you're getting what you're saying. We've seen that several times with other organizations that we have consulted with, but it also has a third tier, which is our high effort tier, typically at a bit higher cost because they're a little more involved, a little more manual. This is where you get into really doing recurring vulnerability and patch management, where on a recurring life cycle, you're continuously scanning your environment for vulnerabilities, you're prioritizing the risk of those vulnerabilities that are found for remediation, and then you're undergoing systematic patching and verification to make sure that you're actually reducing the available attack surfaces that someone has once they get inside your perimeter or to use to get inside your perimeter. If you combine that with penetration testing, you're also getting what does it look like when someone actually tries to attack me? I get that maybe I have vulnerabilities, but what does that really mean? This is an operational test that tests where you are today from your technical controls, your detection, and your patch and vulnerability management. It's going to provide real simulated testing and real output on what you can do to minimize your vulnerability to actual attackers. Any of these services from tier 2, tier 3 can typically be also combined with something like an element management solution. The goal there is you may have less staff than you want supporting your infrastructure. You may have less expertise than you want supporting your IT OT infrastructure. You may have more expertise in one area versus the other. Leveraging an MSSP to provide element management services gives you access to a deep bench of talent that lets you pull from when you need it. So if you need advice on when to upgrade firmware, when to make a different config change, or you just need support doing that, element management is the right path to go because it gets you access to those resources that can also respond immediately in the event of a security incident. If you need a new security policy put in place, if we need to create an ACL or an access control list to block a DDoS attack, we have the capability to typically do that, depending on the tooling in your organization. We see the outcomes there. 40% of OT assets have exploitable vulnerabilities and they're connected to the internet. Vulnerability management, patching, help with that. Penetration testing makes the case to the executives and the other departments on why we need to fund that. And element management gives us a direct path for remediation.
So I would just like to emphasize, as a CIO, I found it incredibly important and empowering to have a managed service provider at my side. There's no way that I could have employed the quantity and the depth of technical expertise needed to provide 24/7 NOC, SOC, element management, and if and when something happens, to be right there to help me recover. So there's just no substitute to having a partner who has that deep level of expertise and is looking across organizations constantly and has that depth and the coverage and the expertise. I'm a firm believer in having a partner, not just relying on my internal staff.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Well, Serena, Chris, thank you so much for sharing your insights and expertise today. And to everyone tuning in, we hope this gave you a deeper look into the complexities, but also the opportunities within airport technology and infrastructure. If you'd like to continue the conversation or learn more, I encourage you to connect with Serena and Chris on LinkedIn. And thank you again for joining us.